So Nagel is developing the concept of the absurd that we saw Camus articulate in the myth of Sisyphus. And recall that for Camus, the absurd arises between or due to a conflict or a divorce between the aspirations and the desires of the self for meaning and purpose in life, and what Camus refers to as the cold, silent indifference of the universe, right? So the idea is that in our lives, we struggle to find meaning and purpose, right? That just seems to be an aspect of the human condition. When Sisyphus is pushing his boulder up to the top of the mountain, he's engaged in his task, right? He has to be thinking about it. He has to be taking the task seriously. But we also are able to see from a certain vantage point that the world itself doesn't contain any intrinsic meaning. There's no purpose or point to the universe as a whole, according to Camus. And according to sort of most naturalistic views of the world, right? The world itself doesn't contain meanings and purposes, right? Meaning and purpose isn't just given in our lives. It kind of seems that way to us, just like it kind of seems like we're free from a first person perspective. But when we really look at the world in itself, independently of how we want it to be, we find that it's devoid of meaning and significance. And Camus sees this conflict between our desire for meaning and the cold, silent indifference of the universe as what gives rise to the absurdity of our condition, right? It's just absurd. And Camus thinks that it's the task of the absurd hero to continually keep this in the forefront of their mind, the absurdity of the world, to know that even though they are striving for meaning and purpose, it will never ultimately be fulfilled. It will never ultimately be obtained, and to continue to strive in spite of that, right? And in spite of that, that leads into Camus' response to the absurd. So what do we do once we recognize the absurd condition? I mean, Camus thinks there's a couple of options there. One option is to just try and forget about the absurd, right? I don't know, I mean, he thinks adopting sort of a religious outlook is one way of getting around this, to think that God is somehow outside of the universe and will return to this infinite beyond at some point. That's a kind of philosophical suicide, according to Camus. It's a way of avoiding the absurd. Camus thinks, however, that we need to continually confront it, continually keep it in the forefront of our minds, continue to strive for meaning and purpose, knowing very well that it will never ultimately come. And that brings out, according to Camus, the best in us, our true humanity, our intrinsic, let's say, spirit of rebellion and revolt, which gives human life a kind of, sort of paradoxically, kind of a purpose in itself, a kind of a dignity and a purpose in the face of this absurd condition, right? So it's what makes Sisyphus stronger than his rock, his ability to recognize his condition and to then accept it, to say yes to it, to say, I know it's absurd. I know I will never fully achieve meaning and purpose in my life, but I embrace this condition. I make it my own. And for Camus, this really puts us into a more authentic relationship with the world and with ourselves, because we're not then avoiding the reality of the situation. We're accepting it for what it is.
Okay, so what Camus is saying is that belief in God or a divine order is ignoring the true reality of the world, which is that there is no higher meaning and purpose.
That's right.
This ignoring the true reality is philosophical suicide.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. And he points to other existential figures. I had to travel down to Southern California for my break, and I was listening to the whole essay on audiobook on the drive. And it's been a little while since I read the whole thing. but I'm glad I got to review it again. I mean, he points to other sort of existential figures who do find a kind of a meaning and a consolation of the absurdity of our condition in the religious life. So Soren Kierkegaard is another famous existentialist. And Kierkegaard was famous for, or one of his main ideas that he's famous for, is this idea of the leap of faith, which has to be taken by the religious person to kind of accept the reality of the divine in the face of a total lack of evidence or justification. And it's that choice which really grounds the meaning of the existential seeker for Kierkegaard. And I mean, very basically, I mean, to be overly simplistic here, right? The attitude is an attitude of faith. Of believing that there is some meaning or purpose, even though we don't know what it is, just having faith that there is one, that God has provided that meaning for our lives. I mean, I think faith is a fine response to take to our condition for what it's worth, because it does recognize sort of the absence of reason or justification. But Camus thinks that this is when we do that, and we think that that's often a way of getting around, of avoiding the absurdity of our condition, of putting up blinders so that we don't have to be aware of this uncomfortable truth. And so Camus' response is this the absurd heroism, right? Rebellion, defiance, scorn, this perpetual tenacity to continue to pursue meaning, knowing very well that it won't ultimately be fulfilled. That is how Camus handles the absurd. Nagel thinks that Camus is really onto something, and that he discovered a very important philosophical concept. But Nagel thinks about the concept of the absurd slightly differently. So for Camus, the absurd is this divorce between our aspirations, the aspirations of the self, and the world. So if there's two terms in the absurd for Camus, it's the self and the world. And it's the collision of those two which gives rise to the absurd, as this sort of, condition that we are then trapped within. Nagel thinks that the absurd doesn't arise from a conflict between the self and the world. He thinks that absurdity arises due to a conflict or clash within ourselves. That because of the type of creature we are, because of the type of being that we are, two viewpoints are capable of being adopted by beings like us. On the one hand, we can view our lives from a first-person perspective. That is, when we're just engaged with our lives in the normal, everyday way, we're engaged from a first-person perspective. We are experiencing the world through our two eyes, right? Through our senses. And things look a particular way from that point of view. But we're also capable of adopting a theoretical perspective, what Nagel calls view sub specie eternitatis, the view from nowhere. What this means for Nagel is that we are capable of detaching from our subjective view, from our first person perspective, and we're able to see ourselves and the lives that we live from the outside, from a third person objective point of view. So when we take an objective view, we step outside of ourselves, we detach from our subjective perspective, and we see ourselves from the outside. Now, it's when we do that that a conflict between the first person point of view and the third person point of view arises. And that's a conflict not between ourselves and the world, according to Nagel, but a conflict within us. Because of the types of creatures that we are, we can simultaneously be subjectively engaged with the world and see ourselves from the outside. And this, according to Nagel, is what gives rise to the absurdity of our condition. So that's the view we're going to attempt to work out a little bit further. And I think Nagel is really on to something with this concept of the absurd. And it's a kind of a condition that pops up not only in regards to meaning in life, but with other philosophical issues as well. For instance, in epistemological skepticism, and free will skepticism, I think a very similar result occurs because of these two standpoints that beings like us are capable of taking.
So Nagel has an objection towards Camus, or just have a different view?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's so much an objection. It's just a different way of thinking about how the absurd arises. I mean, ultimately the conception is the same, but Nagel is taking it a little bit further, and he's saying, look, it's not strictly speaking because of a certain conflict between the self and the world, but because of 2 points of view that creatures like us are capable of taking. So he's not disagreeing with Camus that life is absurd, but he just sees the origins of absurdity in slightly a different way than Camus does.
Okay.
One place in which one place in which Nagel departs from Camus is in how he thinks we ought to respond to the absurd. So for Camus, the response to the absurd is revolt, scorn, rebellion, defiance, right? Nagel thinks that heroism isn't what we need. We don't need heroism in the face of the absurd. What we need is a detached form of irony. I mean, basically, we need to have a sense of humor, according to Nagel, about this condition. He thinks it's ultimately one of the most interesting things about us, is that the absurdity of our condition actually makes us interesting. It's what gives rise to developments within science, within literature, within the arts. And so Nagel ultimately thinks this is like something we should actually enjoy and find humorous. He suggests that we approach the situation with irony as opposed to despair or heroism in the way that Camus wanted us to approach the situation. So that's the kind of view that we're going to be working out here with Nagel. Yeah, would Camus object to Nagel? Would Camus object to Nagel? That's a good question. Let's hold it. We'll maybe think about that as we move through this a little bit further. Okay, so Nagel begins his paper by debunking 3 different arguments for why people often think that life is absurd. In other words, when you ask somebody, like, why do you think that life is absurd? I mean, we all sort of have a general sense, I think, at least at certain moments, that life is absurd. And Nagel thinks that the arguments that people normally give for why life is absurd are lacking. And he tries to dispel 3 different kind of common arguments that people give in order to work out his own view of the absurd. So the first argument that Nagel deals with, this is an argument that people will often give for why life seems absurd, is that nothing we do now, nothing we do in the present, will matter in a million years. And that makes it so that nothing we do now matters at all, right? So the idea is that, hey, look, a million years from now, all of your concerns, all of your projects, all the things you find to be significant and meaningful won't matter, right? It'll all just be gone, right? There might not even be anybody around to care about any of those sorts of things. If you're not happy with a million years, make it, I don't know, 2 million years or 3 million years, right? Even the further you push it back, it's almost guaranteed that at some point, none of the things that we do right now are going to matter, right? And so that can make it seem like nothing matters in the present, right? Nothing matters now. Since it's not going to matter a million years from now, nothing I do now actually matters. The fact that it won't matter in a million years makes it so that nothing matters now. Nagel thinks this isn't a very good argument, though. He doesn't accept this line of reasoning. Do you know why Nagel doesn't accept this? What does Nagel think is wrong with this line of reasoning here? Why doesn't he think that this actually captures why life is absurd. So the idea would be, hey, well, in the future, I mean, yeah, some things seem to matter to you now, but ultimately, I mean, in the future, it's no longer going to matter. And the idea then is, so it doesn't matter now. I mean, your response there, Joseph, is to say, hey, well, I mean, it does seem like you kind of, I mean, some things matter. I mean, finding, a cure for a deadly disease is not the same as walking out your door. But then, I mean, it still seems like this worry might creep in, though. I'm not sure it has fully responded to this argument that, yeah, but that, the important discovery maybe it's just totally irrelevant in a million years from now. And then that can make it seem like the important discovery is actually on par with walking out your door, that there really isn't actually a distinction in terms of meaningfulness between them. So what Nagel wants to say is, so nothing we do now will matter in a million years, so nothing matters now. If we adopt that line of reasoning, then it also doesn't matter now that nothing I do now will matter in a million years, right? If nothing mattering in a million years makes it so that nothing matters now, then it also doesn't matter now that nothing will matter in a million years. So something not mattering in a million years then has no bearing on whether or not it matters now. Yeah. The argument is self-undermining. It doesn't matter that nothing we do now will matter in a million years. That can't be a relevant factor in whether or not something is meaningful, according to Nagel. I mean, the point here is to say, at a very general level, something mattering in a million, there's a typo that something mattering in a million years is not what is relevant to something mattering now. I mean, even more generally, the future state of something mattering, right, of something mattering in the future is not relevant to whether or not something matters in the present. I mean, something can matter now, and it may not matter in a million years from now, but that's not a relevant factor. That's not a relevant condition to making something matter in the present. I mean, so you're going to be writing a philosophy paper soon, and you might think, hey, that's not going to matter in 20 years. Writing that philosophy paper is going to be totally insignificant 20 years from now when I look back on the hopefully it's actually more significant than that. But I mean, likely, right? Writing your term paper is not going to be a meaningful thing. It's not going to matter 20 years from now. But that doesn't make it not a meaningful thing to do in the present, right? In the present, you still seem to have reasons for caring about writing the paper, even though at some indefinite specified future date, it will no longer matter. So Nagel wants to say, this can make it seem like this is why life is absurd, but the fact that something won't matter in the future isn't a really good reason for thinking that things don't matter in the present. The future state of meaningfulness of some state of affairs doesn't have any relevance on whether or not it matters now, is Nagel's point. So developing a vaccine, even if it doesn't matter in a million years from now, it does matter in the present, right? So that can't be why life is absurd, according to Nagel. So he wants to say this isn't a very good reason for thinking that life is absurd. Another argument that's often given is that life is absurd because we are just tiny specks in the infinite vastness of the universe, mere instances that will soon be gone. So if we think about our lives on both on the scale of time in terms of the length of the universe will continue to be present. It's been around, what is it, 9 billion years? Is that the length of the universe? Is it 4 or 9? Something like that. Billions of years, right? The universe is very old, and it will continue to exist long after we're gone. So just the vastness of time makes us seem very small and insignificant in the vastness of things. And on a spatial scale as well, we exist on a tiny globe orbiting a sun, which is one solar system out of what 100 billion solar systems in the Milky Way galaxy. I mean, it's crazy how small we are. And then that galaxy is one out of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe, possibly trillions of galaxies. I mean, we are just absurdly small in the context of the universe. And this can make it seem like, I mean, things look really important to us down here on the earth, but when you think about this in contrast to the vastness of the universe, our concerns seem pretty arbitrary and insignificant, right? So this might be a reason then for thinking that life is absurd. Nagel thinks this is a reason that people often give, but he also thinks this isn't a good argument either. This isn't a good argument for thinking that life is absurd. Why doesn't he think that this is a very good argument? And this one here, you know, Nagel wants to say, look, the size of something doesn't make it more or less absurd. How long something exists doesn't make it more or less absurd. That can't be what makes life absurd. I mean, he imagines, you know, someone who lives forever. Imagine your life lasted forever. Would that make your life less absurd if you lived forever? Or would it just make it infinitely absurd, right? I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think that's right? Because it seems like even if you didn't die, even if you just continued to live eternally, or just, you know, for a crazy amount of time, that wouldn't make life less absurd than a life which is, I don't know, maybe if you're lucky, 75 years. So the length of a life doesn't seem to be the amount of time a being is around, doesn't seem to increase or decrease the absurdity of that life, according to Nagel. And likewise, I mean, Nagel has us imagine a being which is much larger than ourselves. Maybe it's nearly the size of the universe itself. I mean, would that make that being less absurd because it's bigger? Right? So we can imagine a being, for instance, with an intelligence at least similar enough to our own, which is the size of a nebula, right? Would the fact of its size then diminish the absurdity of its life? Nagel thinks, well, no. I mean, a being could be the size of the universe and it would just, its life would just be absurd on a much larger scale. So Nagel thinks this can't be what makes life absurd, the fact that we're just a tiny speck in the vast universe, mere instances that will soon be gone. So Nagel thinks this isn't what makes life absurd. And the final argument he considers, which is one that we were actually talking quite a bit about when we were going through Camus, the argument that people will often give is that life is an elaborate journey leading nowhere. And this is what makes life absurd. We're all mortal. We're all going to die at some point. And what that means is that all chains of justification will leave off midair. That is, suddenly our lives will be abruptly cut short. And all of the justifications we have for what we do will no longer be relevant, right? They'll just be gone. Everything we care about, we desire about, all our aspirations, all the reasons we have, all the purposes we think we have, they'll just be gone. They'll be left off midair. And so this can bring with it the sense that life is just an elaborate journey which ultimately leads nowhere, which doesn't result in anything, in which no purpose is achieved. And this is a kind of a sentiment that people will often express when they're thinking about absurdity. But Nagel also thinks this isn't a very good argument for thinking that life is absurd. Do we know why? Why doesn't he think this is a good argument? let me stop you there. So, yeah, so I hear the sentiment you're expressing. It's like, look, I mean, if we really understood the consequences of our actions and the way in which we could affect, let's say, the course of human history, we'd see that, you know, even though our lives, our particular lives will end, the way in which we live our lives will either give meaning or take meaning away from the people who we affect or the events that we affect. But the way in which you're describing that is such that, like, look, one event leads to another event, which gives it its meaning. And because that event leads to some other event, that gives it its meaning. It looks like when you do that, you have to keep giving justifications at every step of the way. I mean, if you just ended with some event and you said, look, it serves no further purpose, like nothing's going to come of this. It just is what it is, and it doesn't give anything more or less meaning than anything else, then it looks like your chain of justifications has left off, right? You've just run out of reasons for why something matters or is purposeful. When you do this sort of like, well, you know, the event of event X gives event Y its meaning, which gives event Z its meaning. You can just carry on that chain indefinitely. And at some point, you're going to have to reach bedrock, right? I mean, you can't just continue that chain of justifications indefinitely. At some point, it's going to give out, and you're not going to be able to provide a reason from the outside about why that chain of events is in itself meaningful. If you always have to give a justification for why something is meaningful, then eventually your justifications are going to run out. And that's what the argument here is saying, is like, look, even if you want to say that some event affects another event, and that's why it's meaningful, well, you have to carry on that chain of justifications indefinitely, but at some point it's going to give out. And then you can see that all chains of justification leave off. They all end. They all end in an unsatisfactory way where no overall purpose or meaning is then granted to the chain of events that you want to say is meaningful.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Like the only other thing I could give is maybe like, you know, we're all maybe it's like, you know, some of us are leaving to a specific destination, or like we have a specific goal in mind, so that's where we want to end. So there's a specific end that gives it meaning or something.
Yeah. Okay. So a specific end, but then even if you like achieve that end within a human life, you think, oh, well, okay, I achieved the end, so it's meaningful. I mean, eventually you die though, right? Eventually all of those justifications, like there's no longer anything to give it meaning. Once you've achieved that goal, it's over, right? You'd still look for something else to give it meaning, but there is no longer anything to point to. That's the worry here. Now, if you, maybe what you're saying here is something that Nagel also wants to say is simply that some things don't require further justification in order for them to be meaningful. I mean, just take the most mundane of activities, taking an aspirin to cure a headache. If you take an aspirin to cure your headache, and I say, hey, why'd you do that? And you say, well, I wanted to, my head hurts. That's justification enough, according to Nagel. You don't have to point to some further reason outside of your wanting to get rid of the pain in order to justify your taking of the aspirin, right? You don't need to engage in a further chain of justifications for why you should take the aspirin. Taking the aspirin is enough. I mean, similar for just other mundane activities, brushing one's teeth. You don't have to give a long, complicated justification for what you do. When you brush your teeth, you say, yeah, I just want to be healthy. And that's reason enough. You don't need to further justify that in order for brushing your teeth to be a meaningful activity to you, right? So the idea that Nagel is pointing to is just because chains of justification break off eventually, as they inevitably do, that doesn't mean that the activities that one undertakes are less meaningful because of that, right? Just because one is going to eventually disappear from the face of the earth, and all of the justifications that one had for doing what it is that they did do are gone doesn't mean that nothing in the life of that particular person wasn't justified. Chains of justification can leave off, and that's fine. If every justification required a further justification from the outside, then no justification would ever be sufficient for anything. But clearly a lot of justifications are sufficient. When I take an aspirin because I want to relieve my headache, that's reason enough to take the aspirin, right? I don't need anything else to justify what I do there. It's meaningful to me insofar as I relieve the headache. So Nagel thinks this also can't be the reason why life is absurd. Yeah. I think these arguments are interesting. Nagel is trying to use them to point to a more fundamental reason for thinking that life is absurd. He's saying that these facts about the universe that we're pointing to, the fact that in a million years, nothing we do now will matter, that we are tiny specks in the infinite universe, infinite vastness of the universe, that all chains of justification come to an end. These are all facts about our condition, but they're not what make life absurd. These aren't the relevant facts. Nagel thinks that these are like metaphors of sorts. They're ways of expressing the feeling of absurdity. I mean, when we look at the vastness of the universe, you've probably had this moment when you're staring up at the starry sky at night. You're like, I'm so small, and the universe is so big. I mean, it does lend a kind of flavor to our lives. It does put things in a slightly different perspective, but it's not the scope or the size of the universe itself which is relevant there. That fact is giving expression to a kind of a deeper, more fundamental feeling, a more fundamental condition that the feeling is an expression of. And that's what Nagel wants to start to dig out. He writes, the standard arguments for absurdity appear therefore to fail as arguments. Again, those are the ones we just went through, right? That nothing we do now will matter in a million years, that we are tiny specks in a vast universe, that all justifications come to an end due to our mortality. He writes, yet I believe they attempt to express something that is difficult to state, but fundamentally correct, right? So these are attempts to express the absurd, but failed attempts. And what Nagel wants to try and do is get us to a more precise conception of the absurd, which is what we're going to try and work out here. Okay, so getting a grip on the absurd. Nagel says that in ordinary life, the absurd arises when there is a discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. I think this is a nice formulation here. So the absurd arises in ordinary life, just in our everyday sorts of experiences, when there's a discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. That is, when we intend for a certain result to occur or for a certain event to take place, and there's a discrepancy between the actual reality, what actually takes place or what actually is the case. So the absurd is this discrepancy between something that we want to be the case or aspire to be the case and the actual reality on the ground. And he gives us several examples that highlight this kind of discrepancy as it occurs in ordinary life. So I want us to walk through the examples, and then let's point out where the discrepancy between the pretension or the aspiration and the reality resides. Where is the discrepancy occurring? Okay, so here's the first example he gives. You give a complicated speech for a motion that has already passed, right? So some motion you're trying to pass at a meeting of some sort, maybe at a town hall meeting, and you give a complicated, in-depth speech you've prepared for weeks. You've done all the research to pass this motion, and you're up there arguing your case, and then at the end of it you conclude and you think, man, what a great job I did. And they're like, hey man, the motion was already passed. We already did that. what's the discrepancy between the pretension or aspiration and reality in a case like this? Where's the conflict occurring?
Are you trying to say that it's like meaningless that he gave the speech after the motion was passed? Could
Am
it
I
be the case that it's meaningless for him to have even gone up there? Like for him, it would have been so much more meaningful because he prepared for the speech. He did all of this work,
uh-huh.
and then it's just, oh man, I'm sorry, but it's already done. Like you didn't need to do all of that. Is
Mhm.
that meaningless?
Well, that's not exactly what we're trying to we're trying to figure out where's the discrepancy here. Where's the conflict occurring? Where's the opposition? Where's the discrepancy between the pretension or the aspiration, that is what's being intended, and the actual reality on the ground?
Hmm. So the reality is that it's already passed.
Right,
And he wanted, his aspiration was for it to pass, right?
right. It's kind of absurd. You would
Yeah.
go to all these lengths to pass a motion, and unbeknownst to you, it was already passed. And I mean, if you found yourself in that situation, you'd kind of think, oh, I kind of look like an idiot right now, don't I? It would be a little bit absurd. There's this like polar opposition between what you're trying to bring about, right? Your aspiration or your pretension, what you're trying to make happen, and the actual reality. Yeah, so there's that discrepancy. And this is an area where we get a glimpse of the absurd, according to Nagel. We're glimpsing it in a case like this. Here's another example he gives. A notorious criminal is made president of a philanthropic foundation. Right? So you've got this foundation, which is, designed to benefit the world, to be a force for good in the world. And a notorious criminal is made president of the philanthropic foundation. Where's the discrepancy there? What's going on here? Where's the conflict here?
The idea that philanthropic foundation is going to be doing something good. It's going to do charity work. Like helping people who are homeless. Providing money for cancer research, stuff like that. And then you have a criminal who is someone that harms people specifically through acts that are, it could be robbery, it could be stuff that's murder, things that aren't philanthropic.
Right.
And he's head of the organization. It's the equivalent of a cop committing to being hard on crime, yet he's part of a gang as the most corrupt member.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? I mean,
it's almost like something you see in like a sketch,
right.
irony sketch.
Right, exactly. So there's a discrepancy between what's trying to be accomplished. Hey, we're gonna make this person the president of the philanthropic foundation in order to do more good in the world, and yet this person turns out to be, a hardened criminal, and that just is a complete polar opposite to what the intention is in the particular circumstance. And so, I mean, it's almost humorous, right? Because the opposition between the pretension and the reality is so stark, right? Another example he gives: you declare your love over the phone to a recorded announcement. You declare your love over the phone to a recorded announcement. Where's the pretension, the discrepancy between the pretension and the aspiration and the reality in this case? I had to think about this one a little bit, but it's like when you declare your love to somebody, it's supposed to be a profound, important moment, a moment in which you deeply connect with the person who you're declaring your love to, right? It's supposed to be a very special moment for the two people together in the moment when love is declared. And recording it to a recorded announcement, I think what he means just there is to like over a voicemail or something like that. It like defeats the purpose of declaring your love, which is supposed to be an opportunity for the two people to connect in the moment, right? For that to be a profound moment for the both of them, and declaring your love to over voicemail seems to like totally defeat the purpose of declaring your love. Yeah. So there's a discrepancy between what you're trying to achieve in that instance and the actual reality. The last example he gives here is you're being knighted and your pants fall down, right? So someone's being knighted. It's this moment which is supposed to be honorable and dignified, and something dishonorable or ignoble occurs in that very same situation. So the aspiration is to confer this dignity and honor on the person, and then this ill-dignified event is the reality which is experienced. So there's just this stark contrast, this polar opposite between the pretension, the aspiration on the one hand, and the reality on the other. So all of these are instances, according to Nagel, of an expression of the absurd as it comes up in ordinary life. Yeah. So these aren't in themselves the philosophical concept of the absurd. They give us an idea of what the absurd is. But Nagel thinks that when we find ourselves in an absurd position in ordinary life, we try to change it, right? When you give the motion, the complicated speech for a motion that has already been passed, and then afterwards people tell you, hey, that's already been passed, right? You feel embarrassed. You're like, hey, I'm never going to do that again. I'm going to make sure I know whether or not the motion has been passed. That's a way in which we attempt to avoid the absurd, right? So in ordinary life, in these kinds of ordinary situations, we can change our behavior so as to avoid the absurd situation from occurring, right? Make sure your pants don't fall down while you're being knighted, or that you declare your love not to a voicemail, but to the person themselves, over a romantic dinner or something. So those are ways in which we can change the situation, right? And make it not absurd. And as the absurd is expressed in ordinary life, I mean, we tried to avoid having those types of situations occur to us, at least, because they're embarrassing, right? Other people might find them humorous, but to us, they don't feel good when they happen. But Nagel thinks that if something is modifiable so that it no longer appears to us as absurd, then it's not truly absurd. Yeah. It's not truly absurd if you can get out of it. In order for something to be truly absurd, it needs to be inescapable. It needs to be fundamentally absurd. And so what Nagel has in mind here is a philosophical conception of the absurd. The kind of absurdity that we're interested in is one which is unavoidable. It's one that we cannot possibly escape from, no matter how hard we try to change things, no matter how hard we try to get out of it. In order for something to be truly absurd, it needs to be inescapable, right? And so the conception of the absurd that Nagel has is a conception of a condition that no matter how hard we try, we will always find ourselves with. And it involves a discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. Okay, so to start articulating this vision of the absurd, Nagel begins with the seriousness with which we take our lives. So it should be obvious that our lives are lived by exerting to a greater or lesser degree energy and attention. I mean, we can't get through life without taking it seriously. Maybe some people take life more seriously than other people, but everyone, in order to get through, has to take things seriously at some point, at some level. There's no other way to do it. Think about the amount of energy you spend on your life. It's exhausting, the amount of time and energy we spend on our own lives. Here is a quote from the text. Think of how an ordinary individual sweats over his appearance, his health, his sex life, his emotional honesty, his social utility, his self-knowledge, the quality of his ties with family, colleagues, and friends, how well he does his job, whether he understands the world and what is going on in it. Leading a human life is a full-time occupation to which everyone devotes decades of intense concern. I mean, this just seems to be the case. All of us have to exert a tremendous amount of energy in order to live our own lives. So we have to take life seriously. It's unavoidable for beings like us that we devote intense concern, energy, and attention to many different aspects of our life. And we do that all the time. So from our subjective point of view, we have to take the things that we do seriously, whether that's the job that we are pursuing, our appearance, the kind of relationships we have with other people. I don't know, even our creativity. A lot of us, worry about that. Am I really being as creative as I potentially can be? Politics, what we know about the state of the world and how we engage with injustices in the world. Our education, what we know about the world. I've just chosen a couple of different areas here. You could add many more, or categories which are more important to you than maybe some of these, but there are many different aspects of our life which we devote intense attention and energy to. And from our subjective point of view, all of these things are very serious matters. I mean, we can, not take things too seriously, but we can't not take things seriously altogether. We have to devote a kind of seriousness to the way in which we live life. And from our subjective point of view, this seriousness is unavoidable. It is something we just find ourselves with as a kind of a permanent condition of the way in which the world appears to us through our subjective view on the world. But Nagel thinks that we have this continual capacity, this perpetual capacity to disengage from our first person subjective point of view and view things from the outside, from what he calls the view subspecie aeternitatis. Subspecie aeternitatis is a Latin term meaning under the aspect of eternity. So as human beings, we have this capacity to step outside of our own lives, to view ourselves from the outside, to view ourselves as, as if we were the objects of a Martian scientist who came to the world to study human beings. We're able to see ourselves in that kind of way, to see ourselves from the outside as objects within the world. So we can step back and view things objectively, detached from our subjective points of view. And when we do this, what do we see? When we detach from the seriousness with which we take our lives from the first person subjective view, the things we do start to seem arbitrary and purposeless. When we get further and further away from the subjective conditions that actually ground our engagement with the world. When we view ourselves from the outside, our reasons, our justifications no longer seem as relevant from that objective point of view. When we step outside and we look at our lives from the outside, we see that so much of our life is taken for granted, right? We operate largely on habit and custom. And the justifications for why we do what we do really don't go beyond the context of our own individual life. And so when we begin to move further away from the human perspective from which things happen to us, or from the perspective in which we engage with the world, a kind of arbitrariness starts to creep in. And we start to become skeptical about the justifications that we hold for doing the types of things that we do. So when we take the view subspecie aeternitatis, a kind of skepticism comes over us. We can experience this form of skepticism, this feeling that what we do is arbitrary, lacks justification, and then at the same time, we have to continue to live and take life seriously. And it's that conflict between those 2 points of view that Nagel thinks gives rise to the absurd. So let me put it this way. When we are engaged from the first person perspective, from the first person point of view, there are all of these areas of our life that we are intensely concerned with, that we have to take very seriously. Yet, when we stop and we engage in the theoretical pursuit, when we adopt a more objective view on our own lives, we detach from that subjective point of view. We step outside of it, right? So from the subjective view, things are important. Things are a serious, there are serious areas of concern when we're engaged from the subjective perspective. But when we detach from that, we start to undermine that seriousness. We start to see that a lot of the things we take to be serious and important don't have any overall purpose or point, that they lack a kind of ultimate meaning or purpose. From the objective point of view, the seriousness with which we take our lives becomes suspect, becomes open to doubt. And that's what we see when we step outside. When we step outside of the subjective view, we see, hey, the justifications I hold for doing the things that I do, they don't really hold from the objective point of view. They do hold in the context of my subjective life. I mean, I take the aspirin and that's reason enough for me in that particular instance. But when I step outside of my subjectively engaged life and I look at it from the outside, all of this looks kind of pointless and arbitrary, right? This is what Sisyphus sees when the boulder is rolling to the bottom of the mountain. And he says, wait a second, I'm going to have to do this over and over and over again for eternity. There's no purpose or point to it. The objective point of view is what Sisyphus adopts when the view subspecie aeternitatis, when he's watching the boulder roll down to the bottom of the mountain and realizing that he's going to have to do it again and again for eternity. He's conceiving of the universe from the objective point of view, such that the reasons and justifications that we hold for doing the things that we do start to fall away and appear as meaningless from that perspective. Okay, so we detach from the subjective point of view, right? We're all capable of doing this. We do it when we're doing philosophy, right? We detach from our subjectively engaged perspective when we say, what does the world look like independently of any observer, independently of my particular psychological and physiological constitution? How does the world look? That's taking the objective point of view, the view subspecie aeternitatis. Now, that in itself doesn't constitute our absurdity. What makes the situation absurd is that we always have to return to that subjective point of view. So we can detach and we can see, hey, things are arbitrary. There's no intrinsic meaning or purpose in the world. And this undermines the seriousness with which I take my life, but I can't help but continue to live a subjectively engaged life, even though almost simultaneously, I'm capable of viewing that life from the outside. You see, it's not simply that what we're seeing is a world devoid of meaning, which makes the situation absurd for Nagel. What makes it absurd is that we have to simultaneously occupy both these points of view. On the one hand, we have to live subjectively engaged lives. On the other hand, we are perpetually capable of throwing everything that we take to be meaningful and significant from our first person point of view into doubt, as seeing it as arbitrary. And this is a continual conflict or discrepancy within us. It's not a discrepancy between us and the world. It's a discrepancy between two points of view that are perpetually open to beings like us. A very similar situation arose when we were considering freedom of the will. Think about it this way. From our first person perspective, it looks like we make free choices, like on the Garden of Forking Paths, that we really have a choice whether we go down path A, path B, or path C. It looks that way from our subjectively engaged life. But when we detach from that subjectively engaged life and we look at ourselves from the outside, suddenly we can see that that freedom that we seem to enjoy becomes suspect. And it's the clash between these two points of view, what's revealed to us from our first person perspective and what's revealed to us from the objective view, which gives rise to the particular form of skepticism about the will, but also to this absurdity of our condition that Nagel is pointing to here. The fact that we can take both of these points of view is what makes us absurd, that we, like Sisyphus, have to continue to push the boulder up to the top of the mountain, but we're always capable of recognizing that the task that we're engaged in from a certain vantage point is arbitrary and meaningless. Now, for Nagel, Nagel doesn't want to say, hey, the world is arbitrary, pointless, and meaningless. Both of these points of view reveal something true. From our first person perspective, getting the boulder to the mountain really does matter. I mean, how else can you push it up to the top of the mountain? I mean, one response there is just to say, hey, that's kind of an illusion. You just think it's meaningful, but it's not really. Nagel wants to say, no, it is meaningful from your subjective point of view. But it's also not meaningful at the same time when you view it from the objective point of view. Both views are true. Both views reveal something about the universe, and yet they're in fundamental conflict with each other. And it's their perpetual conflict in us, which gives rise to our absurd condition.
Now, Nagel thinks this isn't something to be upset about. He, in fact, thinks that this is what makes human beings interesting. It's what leads to results in the arts, for instance, right? Breakthroughs in artistic development, breakthroughs in the sciences, breakthroughs in philosophy arise because we have this very strange capacity to view ourselves, our subjective states, as the objects of our objective objects of our own cognition. What that means is we can begin to see patterns, flaws in the system of justification, cracks in the wall, and do things with that creatively because we can't take this step back. But at the very same time, it makes human life a questionable endeavor, right? Something with a big question mark at its heart. What is absurd about the situation is that we can experience this form of skepticism about our lives, and yet we must continue to live nonetheless. I mean, there's a way out of that. You can find a way to forget about the absurd, at least for a time. But Nagel thinks if you continue to live, the absurd is inescapable because both of these views are open to you.
So the absurd for Nagel is the collision between the seriousness with which we take our life and, quote, the perpetual possibility of regarding everything about which we are serious as arbitrary and open to doubt. Right? So again, I just want to highlight that what's at stake here is a conflict between 2 points of view. It's not a conflict between the self and the world, as it was for Camus. It's a conflict between 2 vantage points that beings like us can take. From one point of view, our lives are seen as a very serious matter. But from another, they're seen as arbitrary and open to doubt. And the absurdity of the situation is that we are forced to continue to take life seriously, even though we can acknowledge that our concern with life is, from another point of view, arbitrary and meaningless. That's where the absurdity comes in. Both views are true. Both are fundamental and inescapable aspects of our condition, and the absurd arises in their collision.
Is there a possible ethical objection to either Nagel or Camus' view of absurdity? Like, for example, does this give license to amorality? If, like, can an ethical framework exist in the absurd?
That's interesting. On the one hand, the absurd would tend to, or seem to suggest, that any moral or ethical system that purports to provide an objective framework for how one ought to govern their lives can't be accurate. So any ethics for an absurdist like Camus needs to be one that recognizes the radical contingency of the principles upon which one has decided to act. And I think for Camus, a kind of relativism in regards to ethics can start to creep in. So it does pose a problem for a robust ethical framework of the world. Nagel, however, it's complicated with Nagel. Nagel writes a lot on ethics, and he is, in some sense, a realist about ethical truths. He thinks that there are ethical truths about the world that we ought to adhere to. But the way in which he works that out is sort of beyond the scope of this particular, of what we can get at right now. I think the general idea is that even if, so from our first person perspective, there's got to be some kind of moral code that we use to govern our lives. And Camus doesn't want to say, hey, it just doesn't matter, so it doesn't matter what you do, right? That would be to sort of not make good on this attitude of revolt or scorn, because the whole idea for Camus is that we have to continue to treat it as if it were meaningful, even though we know that the universe won't be ethically good in the way that we desire it to be, that we won't find meaning or purpose in the way in which we would ultimately like to be satisfied. But it's that perpetual dissatisfaction and the continuance, despite of it, to continue to act as if the world were meaningful, which then gives it a kind of, in its own way, a meaning and a purpose. And so for Nagel too, ethical concerns are going to govern our lives from the subjective first person perspective, right? So when we are engaged in the world from our first person perspective, if we care about anything, there are going to be ethical demands that are placed upon us. In terms of how an ethical sort of obligation to understand the world, to act in a certain way within it, the kind of ethical relationships that or norms that govern our relationships, whether it's the relationship between friends, between a parent and a child, between siblings, between a teacher and a student. These are all ethical concerns that have to be dealt with from the subjective point of view. When we move into the objective point of view, that starts to seem arbitrary. That starts to seem like, maybe those norms, those ethical norms, aren't as important and binding as they seem from the subjective perspective. But Nagel thinks you have to be able to recognize that and at the same time return to the subjective point of view, meaning that you'll have to continue to behave ethically. So Nagel doesn't think this is any reason for saying, hey, I can do whatever I want. So the objection here would be to say, look, it encourages a kind of amorality, because when I step out into the objective view, then the ethical norms that govern my life are undermined. But Nagel thinks, well, that's true from the objective point of view, but that's not an engaged point of view. When you come back to your subjectively engaged life, those ethical norms still bind you, are still relevant within that context. And so what you have to do, if you want to recognize the absurd for Nagel, is recognize the kind of perpetual possibility of being skeptical about those norms and then also adhering to them nonetheless. And that's what makes the situation absurd. I mean, if you could just get away from it, if you could just step into the objective point of view and say, hey, nothing matters, that would be great, I suppose. But Nagel thinks that that's not how it actually works out, because you then have to go back and engage from the subjective point of view. And when you do engage from that point of view, things matter, right? Ethical norms are binding, even if we have thrown them into doubt in the step backwards, in the view subspecies aeternitatis. So maybe that was a long-winded way of trying to answer that question. I think it's an interesting question.
It was an interesting answer.
Good. Yeah. So for Nagel, the absurd arises not just in the step backwards, because if it were just the step backwards, we could say, hey, it's meaningless and we don't have to do anything in response to that, right? This is the kind of nihilism that Camus actually rejects, right? Because you might say, hey, from this perspective, I can see there's no intrinsic meaning, so why should I care about anything? And what Nagel wants to say is, you're going to care about things because you can't help but care about things. If you're not a psychopath, ethical norms are still going to bind you. And you have to simultaneously be able to be bound by ethical norms, or on the other hand, to pursue meaning and purpose, and at the same time recognize that you can always throw those norms or those meanings or those purposes into doubt. And it's that uneasy tension between those points of view which constitutes our absurdity, right? It's the collision between them. Okay. So from our subjective, first personal point of view, we can't help but treat our lives as meaningful, purposeful, and significant. And at the very same time, we always have the capacity to view our lives from the outside, from a third person, a third personal objective point of view. Yet when we view our lives from the outside, we see that the meaning, purpose, and significance we imbue our lives with is arbitrary and open to perpetual doubt. And the absurdity lies in the internal collision of these points of view, because both are inescapable for creatures like us. Yeah.
And he has a nice section in here. If you haven't read it, I really recommend going through and reading it on epistemological or philosophical skepticism, what we spent so much time on in this course. And Nagel essentially says, look, there's no argument against epistemological skepticism. I roughly agree with Nagel in that sense. I think there's no knockdown argument against skepticism. I think there may be flaws in the kind of skepticism that Hume puts forward, and even in the type of skepticism that Descartes put forward. But I don't know if there's any knockdown answer to the skeptic. And Nagel takes this ability to raise the skeptical question, am I in a dream, right? How do I know that I'm not dreaming? And he says, look, this is, we can do this because we are the types of creatures that can step back from our own immediate engagement with the world and ask what's really going on. So skepticism arises because of our absurd condition, because we can occupy both those points of view. And Nagel says, look, there is no answer to skepticism. There's no knockdown answer to skepticism. It's a perpetual argument that we have to work with and try to respond to. And Nagel says, well, look, what happens when you spend some time thinking about skeptical arguments, external world skepticism or global skepticism? Well, look, when I walked you through dream doubt, right? Or evil demon doubt, or I walked you through Hume's arguments, you may have said, yeah, I mean, there is something in those arguments, and they're very hard to refute. But it doesn't mean that we abandon all of our beliefs in the external world. Hume actually recognized this pretty explicitly. He says, look, I can't give you an answer to these skeptical arguments, but I'm going to believe the external world exists nonetheless, because that's what I do as a human being. I have to believe that the world exists. And what Nagel says is, what happens when we engage in that skepticism? Well, we don't abandon our beliefs in the external world, but we come back to those beliefs in a new way. So after you go through all the skeptical arguments and you realize how sort of difficult it is to justify the existence of an external world, that is a way of sort of loosening maybe some of the unexamined convictions that lie at the basis of the worldview. Now, it doesn't mean you abandon your belief in science or your belief in the possibility of objective accounts or theories of the world, but it does mean that you come back to your beliefs with a new attitude, right? You're actually more perceptive about the flaws in the belief system that you work with. And Nagel says this is very important. It's very important if you're a scientist, for instance, or if you're a philosopher. I think it's also very important if you're an artist to have a questioning, inquiring mind, to see beyond just the surface of things and to ask for deeper justifications. That's what skepticism allows us to do. It allows us to gain a deeper insight. It might not give us certainty, but it gives our beliefs a new flavor. And Nagel thinks this is what's happening when we recognize the absurdity of life. We don't just abandon our belief that life is meaningful, but we come back to it in a new way. He says it's sort of like leaving a partner that you have and then coming back to them later on and saying, I actually want to be with you. So maybe you've been unfaithful to a partner and you break up, but you say, I want to come back, and the person is, kind of willing enough to say, yeah, okay, let's restart that relationship. Well, if you come back to that relationship, it's not the same relationship anymore, right? You've been through too much, but you come back and this relationship is still there, but now it's new. It has a different flavor. It has a different feel. This is what Nagel thinks happens to us when we think through these skeptical arguments. It's also what happens to us when we consider the absurd as a philosophical concept. So the force of habit is so strong in us that we must continue to live even if there aren't sufficient grounds. Nagel writes, unable to abandon the natural responses on which they depend, we take them back like a spouse who has run off with someone else and then decided to return, but we regard them differently. We have this new attitude about things. The same situation holds when we have put the seriousness with which we take our lives into question. We then return to our lives as we must, but our seriousness is laced with irony. Okay, so what does Nagel mean here? Our seriousness is laced with irony. Why would our seriousness be laced with irony after we've gone through this philosophical, I mean, for Nagel, it would have to be deep, like you'd have to recognize how the absurd is actually a feature of your life, which requires some meditation. But why would he say that after returning from this meditation on the absurd back to seriousness with which you take life, that seriousness is now laced with irony?
I think it's because once you have like you said with a relationship, like once you have that seriousness, you have you have knowledge that predates that seriousness that kind of like changes your perspective on it. Like you can't really forget it. It's always lingering in the back of your head. But the seriousness you had before you kind of go into that meditation, it's supposed to be the same. You're supposed to have that same seriousness about like your daily tasks and the things you do. But you can't really go back to the same thing when you have like a philosophical like breakthrough, and that includes the seriousness as part of it. It says, oh, okay, there's a clash between my seriousness and this existential question of, does it matter in like an objective like standpoint? And you're supposed to like understand that, acknowledge that, and then go back to seriousness. And it's like, okay, but what about everything I just did?
Right.
And
Right.
and then you can't really just like be standing in like a void of just like limbo between, I don't know if something matters or not. You have to like do something, and it essentially always comes back to seriousness because there's always like bills to pay and like things to do. So you can't really like give up, you know?
Yeah, that's right. Very well said. And I like the way you put that. Once the philosophical breakthrough occurs, and that's the way in which Camus really conceived this. Camus thought that the realization of the absurd was a kind of awakening, sort of a deep philosophical insight, which transforms one's vision of the world. And it's sort of hard to talk about what happens in such a transformation. Like, what is a philosophical transformation? Because it doesn't seem to be the same type of transformation, at least on the face of it, that we talk about when we talk about like a chemical transformation. One substance changes, let's say, into another substance. But there seems to be something that happens in the philosophical pursuit such that when one achieves a certain level of insight, there's no way to see the world the same way, right? There's no way of going back. So the change is, in some sense, permanent, and it's not necessarily at the level of the physical constituents of one's individual life. It has something to do with the way in which one sees the world. And Nagel is saying that the recognition of the absurd is that type of insight, and that when it occurs, you come back to life differently, right? You return, in Plato's sense, you come back down to the cave in a new way. You see things differently, right? And Nagel is saying you see the irony of it all, right? So you recognize there is something almost Buddhist about this, right? When you're engaged in life, the seriousness of life, you still have this attitude of like, you can still sort of step back, and it's now sort of embedded in your seriousness, so that the seriousness and the absurdity are sort of one and the same. And it leads to a new flavor. There's a whole artistic movement, absurdism, which is based upon Camus' notion, and it was sort of developed by the surrealists and sort of morphed into Dadaism at a certain point, avant-garde art. But the idea was to to recognize the absurdity confers a kind of freedom, a kind of creative freedom to explore the foundations of things, right? Explore the foundations of the presuppositions that keep things running. I mean, we just think of our contemporary culture. There's all sorts of presuppositions that keep things running, that make sure that there's still food at the supermarket, that we have student loan bills to pay, that we have family arrangements in the way that we do. There's all sorts of presuppositions in this. And the insight here tends to show us how these foundational beliefs and habits operate, and allow us to work with it, right? To recognize the necessity of having those unquestioned assumptions and engaging them, but at the same time realizing that we can always take this step back and put them into question.
So Nagel asks this question, and I wonder if you. So he asks the question, why is the life of a mouse not absurd? So if you take the life of a mouse, do we want to say the life of a mouse is absurd? Would we say that the life of a mouse is absurd? What do you think? Is the life of a mouse absurd?
No,
Okay, good. Why not?
because the mouse doesn't have the same points of view as we do. The mouse only has the subjective point of view.
Yeah, it can only be engaged from the subjective point of view, right? That's the only view which the mouse is capable of adopting. I mean, if the mouse were capable of self-reflecting and saying, I see that there's these people who are setting up this maze that I'm running through, et cetera, and yet I have to continue to run through this maze and chase the cheese, even though I know what the situation is from the outside, then the life of the mouse would become absurd, right? So it's not absurd if if it doesn't have this capacity for self-transcendence, for this capacity to place itself into the world that it's trying to understand. Nagel writes of the mouse, he lacks the capacities for self-consciousness and self-transcendence that would enable him to see that he is only a mouse. If that did happen, his life would become absurd, since self-awareness would not make him cease to be a mouse and would not enable him to rise above his mousy strivings, right? So when we become conscious of the subjective mode through which we engage our lives, we have in some sense gotten outside of ourselves. We're thinking about our subjective lives from the outside as the object of our thought, right? So we can think about ourselves as little tiny specks of dust in the universe. A mouse can't do that. It can't think of itself from the outside in that way. I mean, maybe other sorts of creatures can. And what Nagel wants to say is that any creature that can do that, automatically their life becomes absurd when they have the capacity to think of themselves from the outside, to take the view subspecie aeternitatis. That's what absurdity consists in. So that's the absurdity that Nagel wants to point out. And I think it helps clarify what the absurd is as a philosophical concept. Camus does a really good job, I think, at expressing viscerally the kind of feelings that absurdity gives rise to. And he also goes a long way in developing the philosophical concept. Nagel takes this a little bit further and gives us a more theoretical approach to the absurd and understanding how it's operative in beings like us. Now, Nagel thinks that absurdity really isn't a problem. It's not something that we should be worried about in the way that Camus thinks we ought to be. Instead, Nagel thinks that we should approach the absurd with a kind of irony. So Camus' response to the problem of the absurd was scorn, defiance, rebellion, and revolt. But Nagel thinks that the absurd doesn't call for anything as dramatic as this. He writes, I would argue that absurdity is one of the most human things about us, a manifestation of our most advanced and interesting characteristics. We can approach our lives with irony instead of heroism and despair. That is, we can view ourselves as a kind of, we can view the situation with a kind of humor, with a kind of detached irony. Say, isn't that funny, right? That we can simultaneously view our lives as meaningless, and yet we have to continue to take our projects as meaningful and important. It's this absurdity, Nagel thinks, which makes us capable of acts of self-transcendence, of producing works of literature and scientific discoveries and so forth, right? Anything creative about us arises from this capacity for self-transcendence. So I think there's something to consider here. What would this really mean to approach our lives with irony as opposed to scorn or defiance? How would the attitude of irony affect how we live? And there's an interesting bit in here about epistemological skepticism and the kind of view we get of the world when we consider something like dream doubt, for instance, when suddenly our beliefs about the world are thrown into doubt. I mean, that doesn't stop us from continuing to believe and to think that the world is a certain way. But if you've really taken epistemological skepticism seriously, you come back to your beliefs with a kind of a different attitude, like a different way of approaching them and relating to them. And I think a change in attitude is probably also suggested here in this move towards irony, to the attitude of irony that Nagel is advocating for here. And we don't have time to go into that further right now, but I encourage you to maybe think further about what this attitude would actually entail.